An analysis of Misha Meyer's The Justinianic Plague, the economic consequences of the pandemic in the Eastern Roman Empire and its cultural and religious effects, by Isabella Robinson, Julia Wright, Rachel Blasco, and Audrey Holt. To start, here is a brief summary of Meyer's argument. Published in 2016, Meyer claims in his work that scholars have not paid sufficient attention to the cultural and religious effects that the Justinianic plague had on Roman society. He states, "I believe that the Justinianic plague marks a significant caesura in the transition from late antiquity to the Byzantine Middle Ages, not necessarily because of its immediate effects such as the large death toll and the collapse in trade, military capability, and the geography of settlement that most likely accompanied it, but because of its indirect cultural consequences. In other words, because of processes that in the medium term were either partly set in train or at least substantially accelerated by the plague, to which scholars have paid insufficient attention." Meyer goes on to explain the controversy over the plague's economic and demographic consequences in scholarship. Meyer introduces past works on the Justinianic plague, including Pauline Allen's pivotal essay published in 1979, which emphasized John of Ephesus' eyewitness accounts in Syriac for challenging the narrative that the plague should be treated and examined as a significant event in Roman history. Secondly, Meyer thoroughly explains an argument put forth by Jean d'Urliat in 1989, in which he concluded that the plague was of no major concern, as well as the influence it had on other scholars. He addresses the claims of Procopius and John of Ephesus regarding the exorbitant death tolls, which compelled d'Urliat's argument. However, Meyer refutes d'Urliat's claim by citing the work of Peter Sarus and others. He goes on to elucidate the spread of the plague, the debate among scholars regarding its origin, and the issues of its retrospective diagnosis. Meyer concludes by diving into the long-term perspective, the effects on mentalities of the Justinianic plague. He describes the signs of a rapid cultural shift that took place in Roman society as well as a result of the plague. And, quote, "a rise in the cult of the Virgin Mary, the emergence of iconolatry, the sacralization of the Emperor Justinian I, and the phenomenon known as liturgification, or religious intensification."
Now it remains to be determined whether his argument is sound. Meyer's first claim about d'Urliat's failure to recognize the plague's significance is better defended than his second claim that the plague resulted in liturgification in Byzantine culture. Meyer's critique of d'Urliat's argument is straightforward and well defended. He first argues that written records, which overstate the numbers, were likely stylized according to the norms of that time, and were not intended to literally measure casualties, but rather to convey the gravity of the situation. Likewise, he points out that many of the poor who were most affected by the plague would not have been able to afford marked graves, explaining the lack of references to the plague among tombstones. Regardless of the actual death toll, the plague would still be considered a significant event to those who lived through it. Meyer goes on to give several examples of non-literary evidence that corroborates the seriousness of the plague, such as archaeological findings and numismatic records. His analysis on the financial effects of the plague also extends the reach of the plague into rural areas. All of these support his thesis that the plague's effects were not overestimated in the literary sources, and that it was a significant event. His argument for liturgification, however, is weaker. He argues that the fear of the plague made people more religious, and turned to new religious practices since they thought it would be the end of the world. Contrary to this claim, however, the Christian faith did not undergo a significant change in the method of worship during the plague. Meyer cites the codification of Mary as the Mother of God in 431 and the erection of churches dedicated to her as proof of growing momentum regarding Mary's significance. However, these events all occurred before the plague. Icons, too, were in use prior to the plague, which began in 541, such as Dura Ephesus, which was from the 3rd century. The most significant issue with his argument, however, is that the Roman Empire had been gradually becoming more Christian even before the plague. Christianity had only been made legal a little over 200 years prior to the beginning of the plague, and had become the official religion some 50 years after that. As Christianity spread and grew in popularity, a fear of end times might have made people more mindful of religion, but this shift would have been of religious pagans to religious Christians, not from nominal Christians to devout Christians. If anything, one could potentially argue that the plague hampered the growth of Christianity, since Meyer makes reference to several instances of cities being turned back to paganism because of it in various records. Even Justinian's later actions supporting Christianity, that Meyer attributes to fear-induced reliance on God, could rather be attributed to Justinian simply getting older and wanting to gain favor in the eyes of his God, which would have happened regardless of any plague. But even though Meyer's argument for liturgification is weak, he does support its significance overall well.
Now moving on to Meyer's evidence. Meyer cites the work of Peregrine Horton and Peter Sars to counter the claim that epigraphic evidence, specifically grave inscriptions, does not suggest that the plague had devastating effects. He argues that the plague would have given people bigger problems to worry about than grave inscriptions, and adds that the poor couldn't afford them anyways. Meyer then goes on to counter Derliet's claim that there is a contradiction in the archaeological evidence and literary sources in regards to the plague. He cites the work of Hugh Kennedy, who examined archaeological evidence in Syria and concluded that there was a massive loss of life due to the pandemic and no contradiction between the archaeology and the literary sources. Furthermore, Meyer examines the papyrological evidence of the plague. Although admitting that it is far too incomplete, he states that the evidence that is available, however, discloses an interesting trend. In Egypt, there was an apparent shift towards long-term tenancy agreements from the mid-6th century onwards, reflecting a change in the appreciation of the value of farmland that may be connected to experiences during the plague. If this theory is correct, it would provide further evidence that the epidemic had a considerable impact on rural regions as well as in the towns. Lastly, in regards to refuting Derliet's claim, Meyer draws on the numismatic evidence and cites the work of Peter Sars as well as corroborating evidence from Michael Kulikowski and Dionysios Stachopoulos. Meyer writes, Peter Sars has drawn attention to a remark by Procopius that upbraids Justinian for failing to relieve landowners from tax, even though large tracts of land could no longer be cultivated due to the plague-induced fall in the population.
Later in the article, Meyer begins discussing the long-term perspective on the plague's effect and starts with the mention of Evagrios, a church historian and secretary to Patriarch Gregory of Antioch, and a person who actually caught the illness. He had the plague but luckily recovered. Later in his life, he experienced the deadly effects of the plague as many of his family members were dying from the illness. This did not affect his physical health, but it had a huge drag on his religious life. The plague led to a lot of doubt against God, and this was not the case just for him. In the text, we learn that John of Ephesus reports how the plague afflicted residents of a Palestinian village briefly reverted to the worship of pagan images and received terrible punishment from God. The text also talks about how the plague was on a long list of horrible things happening in the world at that moment in time. Other disasters like earthquakes, murder, and war were also happening, so the addition of the plague heightened the anger towards the universe, which sent people into hysteria. The plague affected the people's religious lives and pushed them into anger and doubt.
Meyer then discusses the apparent changes in Christian worship that took place during this period. He references The Church and Mary, a book from 2004, when discussing how greater emphasis had come to be put on Mary in the years prior to the plague. He also cites Adgar's Mary in London from 1886. This book he uses as evidence that the Byzantines turned to Mary during the plague because of a rededication of a certain feast to her. When discussing iconography, Meyer cites several works, such as The Cult of Images in the Age Before Iconoclasm from 1954. However, Meyer claims mistakenly that early Christians rejected icons, when what had actually been banned was the worship of pagan idols. The veneration of images of the Christian God were used at least a century before the plague. Meyer also discusses at length the actions of Justinian in support of Christianity. Here he directly cites Justinian's eulogy of imperial buildings by Procopius concerning the number of churches built under Justinian. Likewise, when discussing liturgification, he compares panegyrical texts, Ekthesis by Agapetos and Ekphrasis of Hagia Sophia by Paulos Silentarios. Meyer uses the differences between the two as proof of a shift towards a more Christian-focused perspective, even though he incorrectly labels the more Roman of the two works as a part of secular history. Overall, Meyer's evidence is good. It is rather his interpretation of it that occasionally is at fault.
To close this presentation, it is only right to evaluate Meyer's argument and his work alongside it. Meyer's overarching argument was to share the large impact the Justinianic plague had been on the culture and religion of people who lived in the Roman Empire, Europe, etc., during the time of the plague and its effects after. We believe he successfully shared his argument. He thoroughly explained his insight, used other scholars to counter or support his argument, and presented growth from his past understanding of the plague. Although the topics and arguments surrounding the plague of Justinian can be rated as controversial, Meyer fairly argued his opinion about the plague's impact, and more precisely, where that impact was mostly directed. He did so in various ways. Meyer addressed this topic by ensuring the voice of other scholars who have studied this plague would be heard. He brought points made by Jean Derliat and Peter Saris concerning their opinion on the plague's impact and what they have studied in regards to the Justinianic plague. In addition to other scholars being referenced, Meyer also referenced his past self. Some years ago, Meyer wrote an academic journal about the Justinianic plague and its effects on the world, but since then he has learned more and changed his opinion. His reference to his younger self show that he is willing to share faults, understand other ways of thinking, and learn from others and himself. His reflection on his past argument shows how firm he is on his current beliefs in regards to how much the plague had impacted the culture, which helps readers agree and trust him. His use of other scholars in his past self, and also providing some history surrounding other portions of life during the plague, was significant in providing readers like us with an understanding of this plague and its effects beyond just his argument. Through his written work, we got a sense of humility and genuine passion for this topic, which ultimately helped us understand and trust him as a scholar to learn about this plague. When reading his article, it was not that he was forcing his argument on readers, but more that he genuinely wanted this topic to be discussed further and for people to see another side of the plague's impacts. Thank you so much for watching our presentation. We really hope you enjoyed.